Welcome to this YSL VBA tutorial. In this video we'll cover how to find web elements in Selenium Basic. The aim here is to create a reference for all the strategies you can use in Selenium to locate an element on a page. We'll start with a simple example to find a single element using its unique ID, and then do the same thing using the element's name. We'll then perform a search which returns multiple elements using the element type, and explain how you can loop through the collection of elements you return. We'll show you how you can narrow the scope of that type of search by specifying a parent or a container element, and then look at how to return multiple elements based on the class assigned to the elements, before finding a list of links on the page based on the text that's actually displayed on the page itself. In the second half of the video, we'll provide an overview of using CSS selectors and the XPath language. These are two very powerful techniques to create dynamic, flexible selectors, but they do require a bit of effort to learn, so this won't be a comprehensive guide, but it will be enough to give you a flavour for how to write these more complex selectors. So there's quite a lot to do in this one. Let's get started. Okay, to get started I've created a new Excel workbook, and all I've done so far is saved it as a macro-enabled file. Just a quick reminder that if you want to follow along with the video, you'll need to make sure that you have Selenium Basic installed, along with a WebDriver for whichever web browser you'd like to use. If you haven't done that already, we do have a video which explains how to get that set up, and it explains how to install the driver for Google Chrome, which is the web browser I'm going to use for this video. While I'm in Chrome, I've also navigated to the main page we're going to be using for the examples for this video, which is the main page of Wikipedia. So while I'm here, I'm going to copy the URL for the main page of Wikipedia to the clipboard by clicking into the address bar and pressing Ctrl and C. Now that I've done that, I'm going to head back to Excel, and then I'm going to open up the Visual Basic Editor from the Developer tab in the ribbon. The first thing I need to do in here is set a reference to the Selenium type library. So I can do that by heading to the Tools menu and choosing References. I can type in the letter S to jump straight into the S section of the list, scroll down a little bit and find the reference for the Selenium type library. Once I've checked the box next to that, I can click OK. Then I can insert a new module into the project. To begin with, I'm going to declare a variable at the module level which will hold a reference to my Chrome driver. The reason I'm declaring it at the module level is so that it doesn't immediately close down the instance of Chrome at the end of the subroutine when the variable goes out of scope. So I'm going to declare a private variable called cd as selenium.chromedriver. I'm then going to create a new subroutine called finding elements. And the first thing I'll do in here is set a reference to the Chrome driver. So I'm going to say set cd equals new selenium.chromedriver. From there I can start the application, so I can say cd.start. And then I'd like to navigate to the home page or the main page of Wikipedia. So I'm going to say cd.get. And then in some double quotes, I'm just going to paste in the URL that I've just copied. So, having done that, I'm going to run that subroutine just to make sure that everything works. It'll open up a new instance of Chrome, navigate to that page. So all that's looking pretty good. So I'll close that down, and then we're ready to get started with finding some elements on the page. For the first example, I'd like to try to find the input box at the top of the Wikipedia page so that I can type in something to search for. In order to do that, I need to have some way to identify that element. And depending on how the web page has been constructed, I could have several choices for how I can do that. One neat way to find out what options you have for identifying an element is to inspect it in the web browser you're using. So in Google Chrome, for example, I can right-click on that element and choose to inspect it. Once I've done that, a panel opens on the right-hand side of the page which lists out all of the elements on the page, and it highlights the one that I've just selected in this pale blue colour. So this tells me everything there is to know about this particular element. It tells me, first of all, inside the open angle brackets here, what type of element it is. This tag name indicates the type of thing. So this is an input element. Inside there is a list of attributes, so every element could have a list of attributes which describe it in more detail. So here I've got a name attribute whose value is search, and an ID element whose value is search input, and all of these values could be used to identify that particular thing on the page. But which one's the best one to use? Is there a difference? Does Selenium prefer one over the other? It certainly does. There is an order of preference for Selenium to locate elements. If you're interested in reading a bit of the background about this, I'll post a link to this page in the description below the video. But here are the element selection strategies for Selenium. There are multiple ways of doing this, of course, and there's a little section just below that about tips on using selectors. And the first paragraph of that says that if IDs are available, then those are the preferred method. So luckily for us, the search input box does indeed have an ID element, or an ID attribute I should say. It's called search input. So I'm just going to double click on search input, copy that to the clipboard, and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor so that we can locate that element using its ID. I'll start with a quick comment just to remind myself what I'm trying to do, so I'll say find by ID, and then I'll declare a variable which will hold a reference to the element I'm trying to return. So I'll say dim search input as selenium.webelement. Now the variable isn't really necessary here, but it is helpful if you'd like to do multiple things to the same element once you've found it. So just to demonstrate how that works. I can then say set search input equals, and then cd dot find element. And you'll see there are lots of find element methods, most of which correspond to one of the search strategies listed in the Selenium documentation. So there'll be an option find by method relating to each of these different options in this list here. The one we're going to use, if I head back to the Visual Basic Editor, fairly obviously is the one called find element by ID. I can then open up some round brackets after that, and you'll see there's a single compulsory parameter there, the ID as a string. I can, in a set of double quotes, paste in what I copied from the inspect panel from Chrome from earlier on, close the double quotes, close the round brackets, and that will get a reference to that specific element. Once we've found an element, we can then manipulate it by applying methods and properties to it. So on the next line I can say search input dot, and then there's a variety of things I could do. I'm going to use the send keys method here to send some keystrokes directly to that search box. So I'm going to send the keys, let's go for Selenium, why not? Once I've done that, I can run the subroutine, and we should see that the new instance of Chrome opens up, navigates to Wikipedia, and then types in Selenium to that text box. Now we can click on the search button to navigate to the results page. And again, in order to do that, we need to know how to identify that search button. So if we head back to my open instance of Chrome and then find the search button, I can right click on that and choose inspect. So we'll find again that there are various ways I could identify this element. So it's got an input tag, it's got a name property, or a name attribute I should say, and also an ID attribute. So if there is an ID attribute, that's what we want to use. Let's double click on the ID text search button, copy that to the clipboard, and then we can head back to the VB editor and create a new variable to hold a reference to that button. So let's say dim search button as selenium.webelement. And then once I've typed in some text into the search input, I can say set search button equals cd.findElement by ID, and then in some double quotes, round brackets and double quotes I should say, I can paste in the ID that I've just copied, close the double quotes and close the round brackets. Once I've captured a reference to that element, I can then do something to it, so I can say search button dot, and this time all I'm going to do is apply the click method to it. So having done all of that, I can run the subroutine again, and it will fire up Wikipedia, type in Selenium into the search box, and then click the search button to go to the first matching entry. An alternative way to find an element by ID is to use something called a by object. Now obviously the by object isn't required in this case, we've already successfully found our elements by ID by using this specific method. However, sometimes the by object is required for certain techniques in Selenium, and this represents a nice easy way to introduce you to the basic concept. So I'm going to declare a new variable in this section. I'm going to say dim findBy as new selenium.by. So by is the name of the class. I'm using the new keyword here to automatically create a new instance of the by class whenever one is required. So I don't have to explicitly say set find by equals new by. Just to demonstrate how this works, I'm going to copy and paste a little bit of code. I'm going to copy and paste the set search input equals cd dot, paste that on the next line, and then comment out the previous line. Clicking just after the dot, I can then type in or press Control and spacebar or Control and J to list the IntelliSense, and then I'm going to use the find element method. So as well as having a specific find element by particular technique, there's a generic find element method. And if I open up a set of round brackets, you can see that the first compulsory parameter here says by as by. So it requires a reference to a by object. So I'm going to pass in my find by object and then type in a full stop after that. And then you'll see that in the list here, there's a list of the different find strategies. So I can find by class, by ID, by name, etc. In this example, I want to find by ID, and then I need to pass in the name of the ID or the string for the ID. So again, I can just copy and paste this from the previous line, and then close an extra set of round brackets for the find element method. I can do exactly the same thing for the search button. So in fact, let me just copy and paste this entire line. This is probably the quickest way to do it. Paste it in below where I'm searching for my search button. I can then comment out the previous line, do a quick swap of variable names by copying and pasting, and then the ID likewise, copy and paste. So I can use the find by object multiple times in the same code, the same subroutine. The end result is identical, so if I were to run that subroutine at this point, I'll end up with a new instance of Chrome, and it will type in Selenium and then click the Go button to find the first matching entry. So there's no real difference in terms of the way it works. The end result is the same, but as I say, the find by or the by class is necessary in certain situations. One example of when it is necessary to use a by object is when you want to check if an element exists before doing something to it. At the moment, our code assumes that the search input and search button IDs will definitely exist on the page we've landed on. But what if that wasn't the case? We can quickly test this by modifying one of the IDs that we're passing in. So I'll say search input ZZZ, and then if I run the subroutine, we'll find that although it lands on the Wikipedia main page, nothing gets typed into the input box. And if I click back on the background of my VB editor, we'll find we've generated a runtime error saying that it couldn't find an element with that ID. Because it's a runtime error, we could write some error handling code. We could write an on-error statement and then redirect the code to a different location to deal with that. But there's a slightly easier way to do this, I think, in Selenium. If I click the end button to stop running that subroutine, I'm going to add a couple of blank lines above my line which tries to capture a reference to the search input. And then I'm going to say, if not, cd dot is element present. What a fantastic name for a method. So the idea behind the is element present, as its name suggests, is you can check if it exists before attempting to do something with it. You'll see that if I open up the round brackets, the first parameter which is required, I must pass in a reference to a by object. So what I can do here, in fact, is just copy and paste what I've put on this line, type in then at the end a couple of blank lines and say end if. I'll throw up a quick message box to say could not find search box or search input box or something along those lines, and then exit from the subroutine to avoid the runtime error when we reach this line. Okay, so having done that, I can run the subroutine again, and this time, although of course the procedure won't work, I haven't found the search input box, I don't get presented with a runtime error. I get a slightly more user-friendly message explaining why the thing hasn't worked. I can use the same idea to check if the search button is present. Let me just reset the names or the IDs that I'm checking for here so that it will actually find the search input. And then I can simply copy this entire if statement and place it just before we attempt to get a reference to the search button. So I can paste that in there and then modify the name I'm testing for here. So I can go for search button. And then let's again just add some extra text to the end of this and then change my message. So I'll change this so that it says could not find search button. Alright, so I can run the subroutine again. And we'll find this time it lands on the Wikipedia main page, and it does indeed type in Selenium into the input box, but it doesn't click the button because once again that element has not been found. So I can click OK and then just reset all of this back to the actual name I'm looking for, and then all of that will finally work again when I run it one more time. We land on the page, type in Selenium, click the button, and end up on the first matching entry. So we've seen a couple of techniques to reference an element by its unique ID, and as we saw in the Selenium documentation earlier, if the ID is present, then that's the preferred method for locating the element on the page. But that also suggests that the ID might not always be present, and indeed the ID attribute is not required. You'll often find yourself working with elements which don't have an ID. So we do need to consider some of these other techniques. For the next example, I'm going to look at the name attribute. Now, the name attribute is usually something assigned to a form control on a web page. If I head back to Wikipedia and have a look at both the search input box and the search button in the inspect panel, you can see that both the search input box and the search button are nested inside a form tag. Each of the input box and button have a name attribute, so the input box is called search and the button is called go. And these name attributes are usually used by the back-end code to reference the data that these elements contain. But we can use those in Selenium as well. So I'm going to head back to my VB editor, and I'm just going to scroll to the section which tries to capture a reference to my search input. I'll do this from scratch. I'll comment out any existing lines which reference the search input, and then say set search input equals cd dot find element by name. So there's a dedicated method for finding an element by name, of course. I can then open up some round brackets and you'll see there's a single required parameter, name as string. So I can type in the name of the element called search, close the double quotes, and then close the round brackets. I could do the same thing using the by object as well. So for the search button, let's head down a little bit. And I'm just going to copy this entire line and then comment the existing one out before pasting in the copy. So we've done the findBy.id. What I'm going to do here is say findBy dot and then use the name method instead. Now the name method, I need to pass in the name rather than the ID, of course. So the name of that button, or the value of the name attribute of that button, was called go. So there's a find element by name and there's a find by dot name method. Having changed both of those things, if I simply run the subroutine again, we'll see the exact same end results. But we know that this one would have worked even if those elements did not have a unique ID. For the next example, I'd like to find all the elements of one particular type. Specifically, I'm interested in writing out the names of each section title on the main page. If I were to right-click on one of those section titles and choose to inspect it, I'll find that in the elements list I've actually selected a span element. Now it's quite likely I'm going to encounter lots of span elements on the page, some of which won't necessarily be related to the individual section titles. So instead we're going to rely on the parent tag, which is an h2 or header 2 element, and we'll find all of the h2 elements before accessing the text nested inside them. Now you'll notice that this h2 element has a unique ID, so we could individually reference all the h2 elements by their unique IDs, but that gets a bit tedious, especially when I don't know how many there actually are. So what we'll do instead is use the tag name to refer to all the h2 elements and then loop through them. So referring back to the documentation, we'll see that we can indeed refer to elements by tag name. So to do this, let's head back to the Visual Basic editor, and I'll start by just commenting out all of the code that we used to find the search input and search button all the way down to searchbutton.click. So I can highlight all that code and then just comment it out by clicking the comment block button. If you don't have that button available, you'll find it on the Edit toolbar, so you can right-click next to any existing menu at the top of the screen and choose to display the Edit toolbar. At the bottom there then, I'll give myself a couple of blank lines and then add a comment, find elements by tag. And then I'll declare a variable which can hold multiple web elements at the same time. So I'll call this dim h2 headers as selenium.webElements. So we saw a web element earlier. This one's going to allow us to store multiple web elements. From there, I can set h2 headers to be equal to cd dot, and then previously we were using a find element method, which of course, as the name suggests, returns a singular element. If we scroll past that list, we'll find the find elements methods. They work in fundamentally the same way as the find element, but they return multiple objects. So I'll scroll down to find elements by tag, insert that, and then the tag name is nice and simple. It's h2. One way to check if I've found any h2 elements is to test the count property of the collection. So I can say something like debug.print h2 headers.count. And then if I were to simply run the subroutine at that point, I'll find that it fires up the main page of Wikipedia. And then when that's finished, if I just close down that instance of Chrome, it should tell me how many elements I've actually returned. So I've found 9 sections with an h2 header tag. We can use the count property of a web elements collection to avoid having to test if an element is present before continuing with our code. Unlike the previous examples we've looked at when finding a singular element, which causes a runtime error if that element can't be found, with the web elements collection, if the elements can't be found, it simply returns a collection with a count of 0. So if I enter a non-existent tag h2zzz and then run the subroutine, we'll find that the code runs, it loads the web page, but I don't get any runtime errors when the code is running. It simply returns a count of 0. So what we could do here is check if h2 headers.count is equal to 0. Then we can print a message box or show a message box which says something like no h2 headers found, and then exit from the subroutine before we add the end if statement. So if I were to clear the contents of the immediate window, again, I'll leave this set as h2zzz, so we're not going to find any elements of that particular type. But when it runs, we see a warning message, a message box popping up telling us that nothing has been found and we won't proceed unnecessarily with the rest of this subroutine. Next, I'd like to list out some useful information about each of the elements we found. One way we can do that is by referencing an element based on its index number in the collection. So just before we do that, let's reset the tag name we're looking for back to h2 so that we do actually find something. And then below the if statement, we can say something like debug.print. Then we can refer to the h2 headers collection and open up some round brackets where we can pass in the ID number or the index number of the item we want to reference. The indexing of the web elements collection is based from 1, so the number 1 represents the first element. So I can then close the round brackets and type in a full stop to access the individual methods and properties of that specific element. I'll refer to the text method to access the inner text of that element, and then if I were to run the subroutine at that point, it should write out the name of the first h2 section that it finds on the page, which should be from today's featured article. And that is indeed what it's found. Slightly more usefully, we can loop through this collection by counting through the index numbers. Let's add an extra variable to help with that. I'll declare a variable at the top of this section called n as long. And then just above this debug.print statement, I'm going to say for n equals 1 to the count of items in the h2 headers collection, so to h2 headers.count. Okay, what I can then do is indent this debug.print statement and say next n. And then rather than always referencing ID number 1, I can pass in a reference to the n variable. In fact, I'd like to also include the value of the n variable, so I'm going to concatenate this. I'm going to say n and then a bit of literal text before I concatenate it with the actual inner text of that particular section. I'll I'll delete the code from the immediate window at that point, and then run the subroutine again, and this time we should see more than one thing being printed out into the immediate window. So it has written out, well, it's written out all 9, although it appears that there is no inner text for the 9th element. But that's okay, I don't mind about that too much. The point was to show you how to loop through the collection. An alternative way to loop through the collection of elements would be to use a for each loop. In order to make that work, we need a different variable. So let's head back up to the top of this little section and say dim h2 header as a selenium.web element. So back to the singular web element rather than the plural. I'm then just going to get rid of the n variable, and I'll get rid of the for next loop as well, just to keep things neat and tidy. And I'll say for each, if I can spell each, h2 header in h2 headers. Inside here I can then say debug.print h2 header.text, so I can refer to the same methods and properties just by referring to the variable name now. And then I can say next h2 header for the for each syntax. It really is a case of personal preference, I think, whether you use a for loop or a for each loop. If I just clear the contents of the immediate window, one thing we do lose from this is the number of the element we're looping over, although we could have included that by just retaining the n variable and manually incrementing it inside this loop. But anyway, if I were to run that subroutine one more time, we'll see we get the list of h2 header text written out into the immediate window again, just without the number in front of it. So finding elements by tag can be quite useful when you don't care about referencing an element by its unique ID. But it can also be quite dangerous, particularly when there are lots of elements of the same type on the same page. For the next example, I'd like to try to return a list of significant events which happened on this day. So if I scroll down the sample page in Wikipedia, there's a section called On This Day, and there's a bullet pointed list showing significant events which happened in history on the same day that we're currently on, so January 19th. If I were to right click somewhere in one of those bullet pointed items and choose to inspect it, I'll find that I've selected something called an LI element, a list item element. So what happens if I try to find all the LI elements on the same page and write out something useful about each one? Well, let's find out. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. I'm just going to comment out all of the code we've just written there for looping through the h2 headers. And again, I'll use my comment block button for that. And then just below that, a couple of blank lines and a new comment which says something like narrowing the scope, which is what this section is all about. So I'll declare a couple of variables to be able to loop through all the list items in the On This Day section. So I'll say dim. I'll abbreviate it to OTD list items as Selenium, Selenium dot web elements, and then dim OTD list item as Selenium dot web element. I can then say set OTD list items equals cd dot find elements by tag. Scroll down a bit, there we go, find elements by tag, and then in some double quotes and some round brackets, li, close double quotes and close round brackets. Before I attempt to loop over these things, it's probably worthwhile discovering how many I've found. So let's say debug.print OTD list items dot count. I'll just clear the contents of the immediate window first, and then run this subroutine again to find out how many list items there are. So if we look back at the results, 218, a few more than I really want, considering there are only about 4 or 5 in the list in the On This Day section. So we need to think about how we can limit the range of tags that we found with the li tag name. One of the incredibly useful things about all the find element and find elements methods in Selenium is that as well as being able to apply them to the web driver, you can also apply them to other web elements. So let's have a quick look back at my Wikipedia page, and if I look at this list item where it's situated in the page, we can see that it's nested inside a UL, an unordered list element, which is natural, but it's also nested inside a div tag with a unique ID of mp-otd. While I'm here, I'm going to double click on that ID and copy it to the clipboard. I can then head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to declare a new variable in this section. I'll call it dim otd div as a selenium.web element, and then I'm going to set a reference to that object. I'm going to say set otd div equals cd dot find element by ID, and then in some double quotes and some round brackets, or round brackets and double quotes, I'll paste in mp-otd, close the double quotes, and then close the round brackets. Now that I've done that, I can apply my find elements by tag li method, not to the entire web driver and the entire page. I can reference otd div. So having done that now, let's see the difference in terms of the number of list items we've returned if we run the subroutine again. When we look back at the immediate window, we've limited the list to just 14 this time. 14 is certainly much better than 218, but it's still a few more than I was expecting if I compare this with the sample Wikipedia page. So I can only see 5 bullet points in this list, and indeed if I look over at the Elements panel, there are only 5 li items listed there. The problem, of course, is that there's more than one unordered list. There's more than one UL tag in this same div tag. So for example, if I look at the list of deaths and births, if I right click on one of those and choose to inspect them, there's another unordered list nested somewhere within the same on this day div. And there's another one here that lists out the different anniversaries. If I right click on one of those and inspect it, there's yet another UL tag with multiple LI tags within it. So basically we need to limit the scope of this search even more. I want to only return the collection of li items which are nested inside the first ul element inside the otd div. Okay, so to make that work, we can break this down probably a little bit more than we really need to, but let's just go the whole hog this time. Let's say dim otd lists. So this is going to return all of the UL elements inside the on this day div. So I'll call this as selenium.web elements. Then I'm going to declare another variable to say otd list1 as selenium.web element. So this will hold a reference to just the first UL element inside the div tag. So after we've captured a reference to the mp-otd div, we can say set otd lists equals otd div dot find elements by tag. So we're going to find all of the UL elements here. So we can elements by tag, round brackets, double quotes, UL, close double quotes, close round brackets. We can then say set otd list1 equals otd lists, and then open up some round brackets and enter the index number of the element we're interested in, which of course is number 1, it's the first list. Finally, for our list items, we can change the starting point from otd div to otd list1. So find all the li items in otd list1. Having done that, we can run this subroutine one more time. And when it finally loads the page, we can have a look back, and indeed this time we do indeed return just the 5 elements. Now this was a somewhat extravagant way to achieve what we're trying to do here. We can make this code a lot more concise, at the slight expense of making it a little more difficult to debug. But rather than writing out 4 separate statements to get to the list items we want, I'm just going to comment out those 4 lines there. And instead we're going to say set, if I can spell set, otd list items. I know that my starting point is to find the uniquely ID'd element mpd-otd, so I'm just going to copy and paste that rather than write it out again. But then rather than having a separate instruction to search within that tag, I can just extend this line by adding another full stop and then finding all the UL elements in there. So I can again copy and paste something from one of my previous lines. So find all the UL elements in the mpd-otd div. It isn't all of the UL elements that I want, it's just the first one. So I can shortcut to the first UL element within that collection of elements by just writing the index number in round brackets at the end. And then I can extend that even further by typing in another full stop. And then I can find the elements by tag li. So again, I can copy and paste that from my previous line. Okay, can I show the entire thing in one single screen width? Just about. So that means that most of these variables now are redundant as well. All I really need is the OTD list items. I'll keep the OTD list item there as well because I'll need that in just a moment, but I'm going to comment out the other variables there as well. So having written it out in 4 separate lines, we can also do the exact same thing in one single instruction. And if I just run the subroutine at this point, we should find that the number of elements returned is once again the number 5. And that is exactly what we get. Finally, in this section, we could just loop through the collection of list items we've returned to write out their inner text. So let's just say something simple like for each OTD list item in OTD list items, we can add a debug.print statement to say debug.print OTD list item.text, and then next OTD list item. And then if I just clear the contents of the immediate window at that point, and then run the subroutine again, we can actually write out something useful about each of the list items that we've discovered. Okay, and we can see that's appeared in there in the background already, and we should have 5 lines, one for each of the items in that bullet pointed list. For the next example, I'd like to select elements based on their class. And to demonstrate this, we'll head back to the example of listing out the section titles from the Wikipedia main page. If I scroll back up to the top and then right click on the first section title from today's featured article, and then choose to inspect it, I'll see that in the elements list I've highlighted a span element. Now earlier I avoided selecting the span elements. I said that it's likely there's lots of span elements on the page, but not all of them would be related to a section title. You can see the first attribute of this selected span element is the class attribute, and it has a value of mw-headline. You can see that there's another span element immediately above this one which does not have the same class assigned to it. So it's quite likely that this particular class is assigned only to those span elements which represent the section titles. So let's double click to select and then Ctrl+C to copy that class name. And then we can head back to the Visual Basic Editor. I'm just going to comment out all the code about narrowing the scope from the previous example. So let's highlight that and comment it all out. And then add a new couple of blank lines below with a new comment, find by class. We can then declare a couple of variables. I'll say dim headlines as selenium.webelements, and then dim headline as selenium.webelement. From there, we can say set headlines equals cd dot, and then I want to use one of the find elements methods, and I'm going to say find elements by class. Then in some round brackets and some double quotes, I can paste in the class name that I've just copied, close the double quotes and close the round brackets, and that will find all of the elements with that particular class assigned to them. I can then write a quick loop, or I could count the number of elements I've returned, but I'm fairly confident that if I say for each headline in headlines, I can debug.print headline.text, and then say next headline. And then if I run that subroutine, we should find that we print out the section titles just as we did earlier on by finding the H2 elements. It's probably worthwhile just quickly mentioning one thing that the find elements by class method can't do. Classes are quite flexible things in web design. You can assign a class to just one single element on a page or to multiple elements on the same page, which is what we've just taken advantage of here. You can assign the same class to elements of different types. So in this example, it doesn't actually matter whether all the headline objects are span elements or a mix and match of different element types. You can also assign multiple classes to the same element, and that is sadly one thing that this particular method can't handle. If I switch back to Wikipedia and just have a look at the TD tag, or the TD element that sits just above the span we've selected here. So TD is a table data cell. It's got two classes assigned to it, main page BG followed by a space and then MP-bordered. If I tried to copy those two class names and then tried to return a reference to those using the find elements by class method, sadly, when I run the subroutine at this point, that won't work. I'll find eventually when the page loads that in the background I've got a runtime error informing me that I cannot use compound class names. Now there is a way to use compound class names, but sadly it's not using the find elements by class method. So you'll see an example of that a little bit later on. So I'm just going to click the undo button to go back to the working example and then clear the contents of the immediate window before we move on to the next example. For the next example, I'd like to return a reference to a link based on the text used to display that link on the page. So if I head back to my Wikipedia example and scroll down to the On This Day section, there's a couple of links in this section based on the current date. So there's January 19 there and another one down towards the bottom of that section. Now I don't need to inspect these elements. The whole point of this particular technique is that you can use the text that's displayed on the page to find that element. So I'm going to head back to the Visual Basic Editor and then I'll comment out the section which we used to find by class. Then give myself a couple of blank lines below and a new comment, find by link text. Now as we saw, it's possible that there's multiple elements with the same link text, so I'm going to declare a variable called otdlinks as selenium.webelements, as there might be more than one of those things. I can then set otdlinks to be equal to cd.findelements by link text. And all I have to do then is type in the text that's displayed on the link. So I've just discovered that that was January 19. So I can enter that as a string, close the double quotes in the round brackets, and then we could print out something useful about the first link that we find with that text. So we could say debug.print otdlinks, open some round brackets and refer to the first element in that collection. And then we could print out, let's print out the attribute which shows the reference it points to, the URL that it points to. So there's an attribute method, and in there we can pass in a reference to any attribute that that element might have. So I'm going to use the href element to refer to the actual URL that it links to. If you're not sure that that is the correct element, the correct attribute, by the way, you could inspect the element in the browser and you'll find that there is indeed an href attribute which gives you the actual URL. Okay, so having done that, I can head back to my Visual Basic Editor and then run that subroutine, and we should print out in a moment. If I just navigate back to my VB editor and look in the immediate window, there we go, there's the URL printed out. We could make this technique a little more dynamic by calculating the link text that we're looking for. If we assume that there is always a link on the main page of Wikipedia which shows this particular format for the current date, so the month name followed by the number of the day of the month, we could calculate that based on the current date. So let's just get rid of what's in that set of parentheses there, and we're going to replace that with a reference to the format function. We can type in format, open and close some round brackets, and then I want to format the current date. So inside those round brackets I can refer to the date property or the date function to return the current date, and then I can apply a string to format the date. So I'll type in 4 M's to format the months as the full month name, and then a space followed by 2 D's to format the number of the day of the month. I can then close the double quotes, and then if I were to run that subroutine again, I should find essentially I get the same thing printed out at the bottom of the page in the immediate window. Indeed I do. So at this point, maybe rather than just printing that out, we could follow that link. So I could copy that OTD links 1 and then simply click on the element to follow the link. So one more time, if I try to run that one, we'll land on the Wikipedia homepage and then jump to the page dedicated to the current date. You can also find links based on part of the text that's displayed on them. So again, heading back to the Wikipedia example, the On This Day section contains multiple links with the word January in them. So I could head back to the Visual Basic editor, and then let's just copy and paste this set OTD links, and then comment out the original version. I'm then going to modify the method used here, so I'm going to click on the Find Elements by Link text and press Ctrl and J on the keyboard to redisplay the IntelliSense. I can then highlight Find Elements by Partial Link text and hit the Tab key to have that replace the original method. Now I don't want to format today's date with the month and the day, so I'm just going to take away the day component and format the date to show the full month name. Now what I'm also going to do is loop through the collection of links that I've returned. So let's have another variable, dim OTD link as selenium.webelement. And then I'm just going to comment out the click method and then wrap around the debug.print statement a for each loop to say for each OTD link in OTD links. And we'll write out the URL or the href attribute of each link that we find. So I'll say next OTD link, and then just modify this code here to say OTD link dot attribute href. Okay, so having done that, we can run that subroutine, and this time we should find that we write out multiple hrefs for each of the links containing the word January. So we've used a variety of Selenium basic methods up to this point to find our web elements using specific techniques. If we just refer back to the Selenium documentation, we've looked at referring to elements by ID, we've looked at using the name, we've looked at using the tag, the class, link text, and partial link text. The problem with having done this is that, apart from the very first one using the ID, none of these techniques are actually the recommended way of finding elements. Don't get me wrong, they're really handy things to have, these specific methods built into the Selenium basic library. They fit into the VBA syntax. We essentially just pass in a string of text to a method to find what it is we're looking for. But they're not fantastically dynamic or powerful. The recommended technique, going back to the Selenium documentation again, is that after the IDs, if those aren't available, something called a CSS Selector is the preferred method. And there is indeed a method in the Selenium basic library to find elements by CSS. Now, CSS essentially combines all the techniques we've used so far into far more dynamic and powerful ways of finding things on a page. The problem with it is it's a horrendously complicated thing to learn. I'm not going to show you absolutely everything you can do with CSS selectors, partly because I don't know everything you can do yet. However, I can point you to a useful reference page on W3 Schools. Here's a table of examples of CSS selectors. You can see why I'm not going to be able to cover absolutely everything they can do in one single video. It probably lends itself to a separate playlist, which I may well get around to creating at some point. But basically what I'd like to do is show you how to replicate the techniques we've looked at so far, but just using the one single method in Selenium Basic, find element by CSS. So I'm going to head back to the VB editor. I'm just going to comment out that last subroutine, or that last little section that we created, and then head back up to the top of this subroutine, right back to where we started, finding elements by ID. So the first thing we'll do is use a CSS selector to find the element whose ID is search input. If I just head back to the W3 Schools reference page, one of the first examples on here shows you how to reference an element by its ID. So if you precede it with a hash symbol, or a pound symbol I believe you call it in the States, then you can write out the ID of the element. And one nice thing about Chrome, I suspect other browsers do the same thing, is that I can actually copy the unique ID of an element as a CSS selector in the Inspect panel. If I head back to Wikipedia and then scroll back up to the top of this page, I can right-click on my search input box and choose to inspect it. And then when I found that element in the elements list, I can right-click on it again and then choose to copy and then copy selector. So having done that, I'm going to head back to the VB editor, and I'm just going to uncomment everything from where I've declared my search input box all the way down to the end of that little section where we say search button.click. I'll just uncomment all that code. Then I've got a little section here which is setting my search input. I'm just going to comment out the last example I did where I'm finding the element by name. And instead I'm going to say set search input, if I can spell that correctly, equals cd dot find element by CSS. If I then open up the round brackets, I can type in my CSS selector as a string in VBA. So in some double quotes, I'm now just going to paste in the copied selector from Chrome. So I'll press Ctrl V to paste that in. And you can see it simply copied the unique ID of that element preceded with a hash symbol or a pound symbol, however you'd like to refer to it. I can then close the double quotes and close the round brackets, and that will essentially do the exact same thing as find element by ID. The by class also supports using CSS selectors, so let's just head back to Wikipedia and I'm going to find my submit button in the elements panel. I can right click on it and choose to copy and then copy selector again. I can then head back to my Visual Basic editor, scroll down to the section where I'm setting my search button, and then I can comment that out, and then I can say on the next line, set search button. Again, failing to spell it correctly. Set search button equals cd.find element, and then open up some round brackets and refer to my find by object. So I can say find by dot, and then refer to the CSS method in there. I can open up some round brackets and some double quotes, paste in what I've just copied from Chrome, which again is just the ID of the object with the hash or pound symbol in front of it, and then close the double quotes, close the round brackets for CSS, and then close the round brackets for find element as well. Okay, so having done all that, again we could replace the find by.id in the isElementPresent methods as well by using the CSS selector, but just to give that one a quick check to make sure it runs, we can run the subroutine and we'll load up the main page, type in Selenium, click the Go button, and end up on the first matching page. Now if these two elements didn't each have their own unique ID, but they did have a name attribute, we can still use a CSS selector to reference them. It's a little trickier than referencing them by ID because there's no shortcut to the name attribute like there is for the ID attribute. But again, using this reference page on W3 Schools, we can work out how to do this. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see that we can check the value of any attribute by writing it out in a set of square brackets, the attribute name, and then the value we're testing for. And we don't even just have to test whether it's equal to something, we can find attributes containing, or starting with, or ending with, etc. So lots of examples here on this page to work out how to reference these various attribute values. To make this work for our particular example, I can head back to the Visual Basic editor, and I'm going to copy and paste the line which sets the or finds the element by its ID, and then I'll comment that copied line out, and then just change the search string here for the CSS selector to a set of square brackets, then the name of the attribute, which is called name, and then the equals operator and the value I'm searching for. So as we saw earlier on, the name of that attribute or the name of that particular object element is called search. If it's possible that there are spaces in the value of your attribute, it's worthwhile wrapping up the search string in a set of single quotes. And then having done that, I can do something similar for the search button. So again, the name of that was Go. So I can copy and paste my search button set statement, comment out the copied line, and then replace the search string with a set of square brackets. The name of the attribute, which is name, equals, and then the name of the element, which was go. So once again, having done all that, we can run the subroutine, and the end result is once again exactly the same. We type in Selenium, click the go button, and land on the first page matching that search phrase. The next thing we did was try to find all the elements of a particular type using the find elements by tag method. And of course we can use the tags using CSS selectors as well. In fact, it's probably the easiest thing to do with a CSS selector. Let's just head back up and comment out all the code for the find by ID or by name method again. So let's highlight all of that and comment it all out. And then I'm going to uncomment the first little part of find elements by tag. So the two variables all the way down to the loop, which loops through the h2 headers. So I can uncomment that. To use a CSS selector for this is incredibly simple. In fact, I'm just going to copy and paste this line, set h2 headers, then I can paste it in just below. I'll comment out the original version of that, and then replace the find elements by tag method by highlighting it and pressing Ctrl and J, and instead use find elements by CSS. And that's all I need to change. In fact, when you want to reference a particular tag, then it really is just the name of the tag and passed into the CSS search string. And again, you can find that out on the W3 schools page to find a particular tag somewhere in here or an element. That's you simply write in the element itself. So having done that, back to the VB code, this should loop through all the h2 headers, providing there are some to find. And then if I simply run that subroutine, we will end up eventually with a list of h2 header text printed out in the immediate window. Even with a basic example such as this, there are more interesting things we can do with the CSS selectors compared to the built-in methods such as find elements by tag. So for example, let's say I wanted to find multiple different types of elements in the same search string. Again, referring back to the W3 schools reference, there's a little item here that shows you can write a comma-separated list of element names to find all the elements of any type that you list. So back into the Visual Basic editor, let's say I wanted to find all the h1 headers, all the h2 headers, and all the h3 headers. These go all the way up to h6, by the way. I appreciate that my variable name is no longer a very good name for this, but I don't want to change it at this point, so I'll just accept that that's not the best variable name. And then in the debug.print statement, perhaps it's worthwhile listing out what particular type of tag this has. So I can say h2 header dot tag name, there we go, and then comma separate that from the actual text. So at this point I could run the subroutine again. And this time we should print out a little more than just those 9 h2 headers. There we go. So we can see we've got some h3 headers, quite a lot of those, some without any text to display. Our familiar h2 headers, and then an h1 header as well without any text to display. CSS selectors start to become incredibly useful when you want to narrow the scope of the elements you're looking for. So let's just comment out the find elements by tag section, and then scroll down a little bit to the narrowing the scope section, and then I'd like to uncomment all of this code in here. So below that comment, uncomment all of that. And I'd also like to uncomment the extra variables and the extra set statements that I commented out earlier on. And then I'm actually going to comment out that single statement that sets the OTD list items variable in one single step. Okay, so I'd just like to modify these 4 set statements to use the CSS syntax instead. So this first example is finding an element by ID. So I'm going to change that to find element by CSS. And we already know that to find it by an ID, we can just insert the pound symbol or the hash symbol in front of the ID. Finding elements by tag, that's nice and straightforward. We can say find elements by CSS, and then we don't need to change anything there. That will just find all of the UL elements inside that div tag, which we've already captured. I don't need to change this. I'm going to leave this one exactly as it is. And then again, for the final one, to find elements by tag, I can say find elements by CSS, and then just pass in the type of element as a string. So at this point, this will list out all of the list items in the On This Day section in the first unordered list in that div. So let's just run that one to prove that that one actually works at this stage. And there we go. So we can find those 5 individual items listed out in the same way we had earlier on. So that's the setup, but the interesting thing here is in how we can combine these different techniques into a single CSS selector to get straight to the OTD list items that we're interested in. But the great thing about CSS selectors is we can do this in a much more succinct way than what we've done here by chaining together a sequence of find element by ID, find elements by tag, find elements by tag again. So to make this work, let's comment out these 4 separate set statements again. And then we can add a new set statement below this one that we commented out earlier. We'll say set OTD list items equals. And I'm going to start by just copying and pasting this cd.findElement by CSS. So I'm going to copy and paste that. And then I'm going to change the method to find elements because we want to return all the list items. So at this point, we can modify this search string. I'm going to say after the unique ID for the div element, I'm going to type in a space and then just type in the name of the tag that I'm interested in, li. So that's going to return any li element inside the div element, regardless of where it's located. So this is going to return more than we want, of course. If I run that subroutine at this point, it's going to return eventually. There we go. Way more than we really wanted, in fact. So you can see that it's got every single list item, all 14 of them, from inside that div. So that's not quite there, but we're getting a bit closer. What I could do now is insert in between the OTD and the list the UL element, so it's the unordered list. Now if I just do that by typing in a space, that's going to return any li element in any ul element inside the div tag. So again, if I were to run that one at this point, I will find that I get way more than I want. I'll end up with all 14 elements again, all 14 list items. So that's really no different to what we've just had previously. The key to this, if I just clear out the contents of the immediate window again, is to use various symbols to indicate the relationship between the different elements. So I'm going to use a closed angle bracket symbol between these different elements. So that indicates that the unique ID here is the parent of an unordered list, which is the parent of a list item. Now, as it turns out, if I switch back to Wikipedia and I find any of the list items inside the On This Day section, I'll find that the only UL element that is at the next level down from the div tag is the first one in the entire section, so the one with the 5 list item elements I want. All of the other UL elements are nested inside a further element. So here in this case it's inside a div tag, and then I suspect a little further down this one is inside another div tag, which is again actually is nested to yet another level inside that div tag. So the only unordered list which is at the level I've specified here, a direct descendant or a direct child of this tag, is the one we want. So if I were to run that one, we'll find that we end up with just the 5 individual list items that I initially wanted. I guess the next obvious question would be, what if there was more than one UL element that was a direct descendant of that div tag? The answer would be I'd get more than the 5 list items I really wanted in the output of this. But we can use CSS selectors to handle that as well. So let's say I wanted to get just the first UL element that was directly nested inside this particular div tag. If I switch back to the W3 Schools reference page again, I can scroll down the page to find a bunch of different modifiers we can place on these different elements. So, for example, I could use the first of type modifier to find the first UL element inside that div tag. In fact, let me just copy and paste that from here. and then I can paste that at the end of the UL element. It won't make any difference, of course, in this particular example, as there is only one UL element that's a direct descendant of that tag, but just in case of future proofing, you wanted to make sure that that was always the case. If I run this one again, it's going to return the exact same five items from that list. If it wasn't the first element I was interested in, but maybe the second or any other number, then again there's a modifier we can use for that. If I switch back to the selectors reference page, there's something called an nth of type. So I could do the exact same thing again here by using the nth of type modifier. So I can just paste that onto the end there. And then, excuse me, I need that colon to separate that. Then I can change the number 2 to the number 1, clear the contents of the immediate window, and then once again run that to end up with the exact same list of 5 list items. Next, let's have a look at how to use classes with CSS selectors. I'm just going to comment out all of the narrowing the scope code, and then scroll down to the Find by Class section. This isn't particularly interesting, or at least the starting point isn't particularly interesting. So we've got the Find Elements by Class. Let's just change that to Find Elements by CSS. And to find a class, we simply need to precede the class with a full stop. So full stop MW-headline. If I then run that subroutine, we should find the list of section titles as we described earlier on from Wikipedia. And there they all are, just as we saw from the previous example. You can also modify the class selector to work with a specific type of element. So in this example, if I typed in span before the class and the full stop, the end results will be the same, of course, because the MW-headline class is only applied to span elements in the Wikipedia main page. But just to demonstrate that you could limit this to a particular element type, you can write them out like so. One other useful thing is that the CSS selector allows you to reference multiple classes in the same element. So again, if I head back to Wikipedia and find an example of that, let's right-click on one of my section titles and choose to inspect it. We'll see that somewhere just above that is a TD element with 2 classes assigned to it, main page BG and MP-bordered. Now we saw earlier on that this didn't work with our basic example with the find elements by class, but if I copy this to the clipboard now and then head back to the Visual Basic editor and then just paste that in as my CSS selector, I need to separate these with full stops. So full stop main page BG and then full stop MP-bordered with no spaces in between. I appreciate that the variable names no longer make any sense, but just to demonstrate a point, if I clear the contents of the immediate window and then I run that subroutine, I'm going to end up with quite a large amount of text here, as you can see. But it's basically printed out all the text from each of those bordered sections, or those table cell tags, TD tags. Okay, so there we go. The final thing we did with specific Selenium basic methods was to find links using the text displayed on the page. And this is sadly where the CSS selectors break down a little bit. We don't have any access to the text part of an element on a page using CSS selectors. For this particular example, we can kind of get around that by referring to one of the attributes of the links we're looking for. Just to demonstrate that, I'm going to comment out the headlines section there, and then head back over to Wikipedia and have a look at the links we were interested in. So these were the links with the current date displayed. So I can right-click on one of those and choose to inspect it. So we can see that this link has a title attribute, and we know that we can interrogate the attributes of an element using CSS selectors. We did it for the name attribute earlier on. So let's have a look at how we can make that work. If I uncomment the section of code that finds my OTD links, let's just uncomment all of that, apart from the click part there, let's just uncomment that. And then what I'd like to do is use the CSS selector to find elements whose title attribute equals January 19. So I'm just going to comment out this OTD links or set OTD links statement and replace it with a new one which says set OTD links equals cd.findelements. Sorry, try that again. Find elements by CSS, and then in a set of round brackets, I then want to have a set of double quotes, and then I could use some square brackets to contain the search phrase I'm looking for, as we did earlier on for the name attribute. So if I just scroll back up to the top to remind you of how that one works, we have the name attribute and then equals, then the name itself. It's also possible using CSS selectors to limit the search to a particular type of element. So for this one, I'd like to limit it to only the link elements. So I'm going to look specifically for elements whose tag is A. To make that work, back in the VB editor, I can type in the name of the element in front of the search phrase and then have the square brackets to refer to the attribute, which is title, and then the search string I'm looking for, which in this case would be January 19. Again, I've written out the actual search phrase in a set of single quotes, and it's important here because there is a space between the word January and the number 19. Okay, so having done that, I can run the subroutine again, and this one should list out all of the links which have the search text or the display text of January 19. We can of course make this more dynamic again using the format function in VBA, but we need to be a little more careful about how we do that this time. So we've got to insert the results of the format function in place of that explicit string in our search phrase. So let me just start by taking away the January 19, and then I'm going to replace that with 2 double quote characters, then position the cursor back inside those 2 double quotes, and then type in a space and an ampersand and another space and another ampersand and another space. So what we're going to do is concatenate the various parts. So the first part of the string will be a open square bracket title equals followed by a single quote. And the second part will be the result of the format function. So I can just copy and paste that from a previous line. And then the final part will be the concatenation of the single quote and the closed square bracket. Okay, so same thing again, just a quick little check that that runs. And we'll end up with the same 2 links printed out in the immediate window for January 19. We can perform more interesting string comparisons by changing the operator after the attribute name. So let's say, for example, I want to find all the links or all the A elements whose title attribute contains the word January. I can modify my format function to return just the name of the month, or name of the current month, which will be January in this case, of course. And then to find out which operator I need to use, I can have a look back on W3 School's reference page and find that I could use an asterisk equals to find elements which contain a string. So if I just head back to my VB code, add an asterisk in front of the equals operator, when I run the subroutine this time, I'll return multiple links, any of which could contain the word January. So there we go, I've got an extra one down at the bottom there and an extra one up at the top as well. If I wanted to limit it to those that begin with January, then again I can just modify the operator that I'm using to compare the strings. So here I can find the begins with, which is a caret symbol in front of the equals operator. So I can change the asterisk to a caret, clear the contents of the immediate window, and then run the subroutine again. And I'll find links whose title begins with January this time, rather than just contains the word January anywhere in it. Okay, the good news, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear, is that there is only one more technique for finding elements that we're going to cover in this video. The slightly bad news, however, is it is probably the most complicated one to learn. And in fact, before I actually even start showing you how this technique works, it's worthwhile briefly having a look at the page on the Selenium documentation website. So the technique we're going to use is the XPath method for finding elements. And there is a little section in this paragraph here about tips on using selectors that it works as well as CSS selectors, but it's complicated and difficult to debug. And although they're quite flexible, they're not often performance tested by browser vendors, so they can be quite slow. So always bear these in mind. XPath is not the recommended method. If you've got IDs, use those. If you don't have IDs, use CSS selectors, and only then should you consider using XPath selectors if you can't do what you need. For reference material, here's how complicated it is. The World Wide Web Consortium maintain the documentation for the specification of this language, the XPath language. So you'll find all the previous historical articles on this page. Here's the current specification. I'm not even going to attempt to read that or point out various parts of it. I'll leave that entirely in your hands. If you want a slightly more succinct tutorial for how to use XPath, then good old W3 Schools has a nice basic tutorial to get you used to the basics. So I'd recommend having a quick look there. Again, I'll stick these links in the video description so you have them to hand. Anyway, just to go back to our example, I'm going to start by commenting out this links section at the bottom, and then going all the way back up to the top to the section where we're finding things by ID or by name. And once again, I'm going to uncomment everything down to the search button.click method, and then look at how we can replace our existing techniques using the XPath method instead. Next, I'm just going to comment out the set search input line once again and replace it with a new one which will use the XPath to locate the element. So I'll say set search input equals cd dot find element by XPath. I can then open up some round brackets and I'll see that again I can pass in the XPath as a string. So I'll just open and close a set of double quotes and then close the round brackets before I start looking at how I can find the XPath of the element I want. A neat way to start actually is, rather than reading the documentation, just head back to your web browser, find the page you're interested in, and inspect the element you want to select. So I'm going to right click on the search input box and choose to inspect it. Earlier I showed you can copy the CSS selector by right clicking on the element in the elements panel and then choosing copy selector. For XPath, I've got two options. I've got the full XPath or just XPath. Just to show you what the full XPath is, this is essentially like a set of directions for how to reach that specific node in the structure of the individual tags in this document. So I'm going to choose copy full XPath and then head back to the VB editor and paste it in inside these double quotes. You ready for this? There we go. So that's basically a set of directions going from the root of the page, which is contained in an HTML tag, into the body tag, into the fifth div tag, into the first div tag inside there, into the second div tag inside there, into the only div tag apparently in there, into the form tag, into the div tag, into the first input tag. Fantastic. It's pretty precise, isn't it? I would definitely end up where I needed to be if I followed those directions precisely. However, you can probably tell that's pretty fragile and prone to errors. If any part of the structure of that main page changed, then my directions don't lead me to where I need to go. Just to demonstrate that it does in fact work, let's just get to the point. I'm just going to comment out the bit that clicks the search button so we don't actually perform the search, just to prove that it does indeed type in the text Selenium into that text box. If I run the subroutine, we'll load a new instance of Chrome and it does indeed type Selenium into that search box. A much better approach, however, rather than using the full actual path to that element, because it is so fragile, is we can find it using its unique ID. So I'm just going to delete that part and then head back to my open Wikipedia page, right click on this input element again in the elements panel, and choose copy, and then choose copy XPath this time. I can then head back to the VB editor and paste that in inside the double quotes, and that's a much more succinct way of doing things. So we're essentially, this asterisk here represents any type of element. So it could be a div, it could be a span, it could be an H2. And then in the square brackets is the search phrase to find that element. So it's a lot like the search phrases for the CSS selectors. It's for this specific attribute, and if it is equal to this bit of text. Now, if I click away from that, annoyingly, it's going to leave me with a syntax error. And that's because the search phrase has been entered in a set of double quotes. And as we know in VBA, we already use double quotes to contain strings. So I can't put a double quote inside double quotes. It's not interpreted correctly. I've got a couple of options for changing this. I can simply double up my double quotes if they're to be contained within another set of double quotes. Or, slightly more readable, I think, use single quotes instead. So once again, we're just going to find that single search input and then we'll type in Selenium into that search input text box. So I'll run the subroutine and find once again we get the exact same end results. Finding an element by using its name attribute is basically the same syntax using the XPath technique. So if I scroll back downwards a little bit and then we can uncomment all the code about the search button. And then we can replace this findby.css technique. Let's just comment that out. And in fact, let's just copy and paste some of it at least. Everything up to the findby dot. And then we can paste that in. And then findby XPath. I can then open up some round brackets and open and close some double quotes, and then close the round brackets a couple of times. And then I can just paste in or write out the XPath selector for that element. Again, a nice way to find these out, to get used to the syntax, is to find the element in the web browser in the Elements panel, right click on it, and we can choose to copy XPath. I can then go back to the VB editor and then paste that in. Now, of course, in preference, it's going to use the unique ID for that element, as there is one, but I can modify this to refer to a different attribute. So where it says @ID, I can change that to say @name, and then I can change I'll change the double quotes to single quotes as well. And inside the single quotes, I'll type in the name of the object, which is Go. So having done that, we can run the subroutine again. And once again, we're getting bored of seeing this page by now, I'm sure we are. We'll end up on the first match for Selenium in Wikipedia. Finding all the elements of a particular type is almost always the easiest thing to do, and the XPath technique is no different to that. Let's just comment out the find by stuff. Let's comment out the search input and search button, all the way down to search button.click. And then let's quickly uncomment the find elements by tag. So let's see, everything from the h2 headers down to the little for each loop to write out their names. Okay, so we've got an example here already, which is setting the h2 headers using the h1, h2 and h3, but let's just comment that out and replace that line by saying set h2 headers equals cd dot find elements by XPath, the last one in the list for find elements, and then open and close some round brackets, open and close some double quotes inside there, and then to find all the elements of a particular type, I can type in 2 forward slashes to go from the root of the document and find all the nodes or all the elements with an h2 tag. Okay, so having done that, I can run that subroutine, and it's going to write out all of the h2 elements into the immediate window. So there we go, h2 and then all of the actual text of those elements. We can also find elements of multiple different types using the XPath technique just by separating the different search strings with a vertical bar. So for example, I could type in // h1 and then a vertical bar to separate that from the h2 elements, and then another vertical bar after that followed by // h3. So it essentially acts as the OR operator. So if the tag is either h1 or it's h2 or it's h3. If I run the subroutine at that point, getting bored of seeing these results by now, maybe we should have picked different pages for the examples, but here we go. There's the examples of h3 titles and h2 titles and h1 titles, some of which don't have any text to display. Next, let's look at how to narrow the scope using an XPath search string. I'll start by commenting out this section of finding elements by tag, and then head down to the next section, narrowing the scope, and then just uncomment all the code in here down to the end of the for each loop. I'll also just comment out these three variables for the OTD div lists and list1. I shan't need those. I'm not going to bother showing you the individual techniques to get to these elements. In fact, we've already seen them, how to get access to an element by its unique ID and an element by its tag name. So what I'm going to do is jump straight to the section which shows you how to combine the techniques into a single search string. I'll start by copying part of this line and then comment out that version of the line, give myself a blank line or two, and then paste in what I've copied, and then find elements by XPath with a couple of round brackets and a couple of double quotes. Okay, a good place to start with this is to get the unique ID of the div tag with this ID, mp-otd. So we could head back to our Wikipedia sample page, find that particular div tag, so I can right click on the on this day and choose to inspect it. And then I've got my div tag whose ID is mp-otd, right click, copy XPath, and then back into the VB editor and paste that part in. Perfect. Next, I want to find any unordered list, any UL element that's a direct child of that specifically ID'd element. So I can type in a / followed by UL, and then I want to find any list item element that's a direct child of that UL element. So I can type in a / and then say LI. Now, I know that I can get away with this because, as we saw earlier on, there's only one UL element that's a direct descendant of that div tag. But we can specify a unique ID number or a unique index number for the element we're interested in. In a set of square brackets after the UL element, we can type in the number 1 to refer to the first unordered list in that section. Now again, I get the syntax error because of the double quotes that have annoyingly been copied. So the double quotes that are wrapped around the ID name, I'm just going to replace those with single quotes, and then that will be fine. All right, so I can run that subroutine again, and we should find a list of the 5 LI elements in the first unordered list within that specific div tag. Okay, let's look at class names next. I'm just going to comment out this section of code we've just been working with, and then head down to the Find by Class section. This one's not particularly interesting again, it's very much just referring to an attribute of a particular type of element. So I'll uncomment the Find by Class code, and let's comment out the set headlines statement and replace that with a set headlines equals cd dot find elements by XPath. And then in some round brackets and some double quotes, we can enter the XPath that we need. So if we're going from the root of the document, we can type in //, and then we can type in an asterisk to represent any type of element. Well, we could be more specific, of course. If we're looking for H2 elements, then we can say H2, and then put in the search string in a set of square brackets. So again, I'm going back to the idea of finding the span elements, which have the MW-headline class. So a quick reminder of that, if I head back to here and find, oh, there's one there already, a span class MW-headline. In fact, I'm just going to copy that from the elements panel. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to go not with H2. I can either go with an asterisk to represent any element, or span if it's a specific span element I'm interested in. And then I can say at class equals, and in a set of single quotes, paste in the class name that I've just copied. So having done that, I can run that subroutine, and that will write out the names of the individual section titles from these spans, just as we've seen several times already. We can also use multiple class names with the same XPath search phrase. So if an element has more than one class assigned to it, we can, let me just copy and paste this from the previous line. Rather than MW-headline, we can paste that in and then just take away these full stop characters and replace the one that separates the two with a space. So main page BG space MP-bordered. I also want to make sure that I'm not exclusively looking for span elements, so I can either replace that with, I believe it was a TD element, which had those classes assigned to them, or just for convenience, I can use an asterisk to represent any kind of element. If I then just clear out the contents of the immediate window and then run that subroutine again, once again we'll write out all the text from the elements with those two classes assigned to them. A little bit more than we really wanted again, but there we go. Okay, so the last thing we did with the previous techniques was to find links based on the text displayed on the page. As it turns out, the way the find elements by link text or by partial link text methods work behind the scenes is to actually construct an XPath selection string. So if you have a quick check on the Selenium documentation website, it tells you that these two techniques use XPath selectors internally. So we should definitely be able to construct our own version of that. It's certainly possible. So let's just have a quick look. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to comment out the find by class section, and then let's uncomment the find by link text section. I won't bother with the links click section there though, or statement. Let's just get this out. All right, so I'm going to comment out the set OTD links statement, and then we can just copy and paste part of that to get started. So we can paste that in and say find elements by XPath. There we go. In some round brackets and some double quotes, we can then enter our XPath string. So this time we want to find all the A elements whose text contains January 19, let's say. Let's just fix it to a specific bit of text to begin with. So I want to go from the root of the document // I want to find all the A elements, and specifically those which match a certain condition. So in a set of square brackets, I can refer to a function in XPath. So I'm going to use the contains function, which has a couple of parameters. So in a set of round brackets, the first parameter is what I'm looking in, and that is the text of the element that I'm looking at. So I'm going to refer to the text function, open and close some round brackets to return the text of the A element, followed by a comma, and then the specific string I'm looking for. So in some single quotes, I can type in January 19. And that's essentially what happens when we use the find elements by partial link text method. So having done that, let's just give that one a quick whirl. If we run the subroutine, we should print out two links which have January 19 as their display text. And indeed, that's exactly what we get. So this is one situation where using XPath selectors is more useful than CSS selectors because you can get at the text of the element you're looking at. There's a whole bunch of different functions available in the XPath specification. Just as a quick example of that, here's the documentation for version 1 actually of the XPath language, but there's a section for string functions, so we've just had a quick look at the contains function, but there's also starts with and various other ones as well. I can't claim to be any sort of expert in using them, but there's obviously a lot more power using XPath when you get into this sort of expression. But I think we've pretty much covered all the basics for ways you can find elements in Selenium. We know now how to select stuff by ID, by name, by tag, by class, by link text and partial link text, and how to construct our own useful and dynamic CSS selectors, and a little bit about XPath selectors as well. I really hope you found that useful. I may well reference some parts of this video in later sections of this playlist, so you haven't escaped it yet, I'm afraid. Well done for sticking with it if you're still with us. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.